Joining me now with some breaking news is Paul Butler, MSNBC legal analyst and former federal prosecutor, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. And the breaking news that we have for you is that, to the surprise of many, including, I'll be honest, myself, the Supreme Court has denied Donald Trump's bid to stay his criminal sentence. He is scheduled to be sentenced tomorrow to no jail time, but as of tomorrow, he will officially be sentenced for the 34-count felony conviction in New York. The Supreme Court asked and answered. They have said no to Donald Trump's bid to stay his sentencing. Ladies first, let me go to you, Lisa Rubin. Your reaction to that?
Well, Joy, like you, I'm somewhat surprised, not because I thought that the Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision should have justified a stay here, but because I thought Donald Trump ultimately would have enough votes to go for the stay. Instead, he lost narrowly by a vote of 5-4. And critically, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett voting with the three liberals to deny Donald Trump that stay of sentencing that he sought. I want to read to you and our viewers the one paragraph that the majority of 5 justices wrote, because I think it's really telling the reasons why they denied the stay. They say, first, the alleged evidentiary violations at President-elect Trump's state court trial can be addressed in the ordinary course on appeal, meaning he can be sentenced and he can still pursue an appeal. And the New York state court system, he doesn't lose that right by virtue of being sentenced. In fact, it's because, and as a result of the sentencing being final, that he would have appellate rights to begin with. And then they go on to say, second, the burden that sentencing will impose on the president-elect's responsibilities is relatively insubstantial in light of the trial court's stated intent to impose a sentence of unconditional discharge after a brief virtual hearing. In other words, the burdens here on him are negligible because the trial court judge, Juan Merchan, has already said in an opinion that he intends to sentence Donald Trump to unconditional discharge, which means no penalty whatsoever. No jail time, no probation, no fine, not even community service as far as I understand it. What the sentencing then does is it's twofold. One, it finalizes the conviction and it makes Donald Trump officially the one thing that he has not yet been, a convicted felon, and it will make him a convicted felon when he takes office on January 20th. But the second thing it will do is force him, at least virtually, that is, because Juan Merchan has given him the option not to show up in person. It will force him to stand before the court and have the judge explain the rationale for his sentence and why he thought it was imperative that Donald Trump be sentenced, given the gravity of the crimes. He outlined this to some extent in the opinion that he wrote on January 3rd, denying the last of Trump's motions to try and avoid this indictment and to vacate the verdict. But he's going to have an opportunity to say his piece in open court and look at Donald Trump, at least on a computer screen, and make it clear to everyone present and the historical record why it is that we're all sitting there, Joy.
Extraordinary stuff. Paul Butler, are you as surprised as I am?
It's a shame that we have to be surprised when the Supreme Court actually abides by the rule of law. But yes, I am surprised. Last year, Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies. That was 7 months ago. Any other criminal defendant would have been sentenced a long time ago. So now Donald Trump will finally receive his just desserts. Now it's unconditional relief, which is a gift from the judge to Donald Trump. It basically, he gets his finger wagged at in court. And I think that the judge will have a lot to say to Donald Trump tomorrow virtually, since Donald Trump doesn't have to be there in person, that Donald Trump will not like hearing, but then it will be game over. He will go on to be president of the United States. You know, last year, Donald Trump said, or actually earlier, last year, Donald Trump said that the sentencing needed to happen after the election, and the judge went along with that. But now Trump was saying that the sentencing should wait either 4 years until his administration's over or never happen. And apparently for at least 6 members of the Supreme Court, that was a bridge too far.
And I'm shocked that John Roberts, I'm just going to be honest, one of his appointees, Amy Coney Barrett, went along with the liberals on the court. No surprise about Alito, who was just chatting with Trump on the phone about a job for one of his former clerks. And His moral compass is very clear. But John Roberts strikes me as somebody who's made it his mission to protect Donald Trump, to protect his feelings, to protect his ability to act boldly, as he said in his ruling that Donald Trump has absolute immunity and he can commit any crime he wants. So I am shocked, and not because I thought there was any merit to Donald Trump's argument, but like Lisa Rubin, I just assumed John Roberts is there to protect Trump at all costs. And I think that's absolutely right. But it's a reasonable assumption. That's right. And there's a tension between Roberts' fealty to Donald Trump and 100%. His fealty to the legitimacy of the court. 100%. And the thing is, I specifically want to talk to you about is that you and I have covered a lot of criminal trials and cases, and you wrote a whole book about incarceration, and particularly incarceration of people of color. I was a couple weeks old finding out that Donald Trump could be convicted of a 34-count felony and still not be called a felon simply because he had not been sentenced. I did not know that that was the rule, and I thought that might be news to many particularly young black and brown defendants, that until they are actually sentenced, they don't have to check that box that stops them from getting jobs and stops them from getting apartments, et cetera. That's exactly right. Yeah. So two things there. First, Donald Trump's lawyer said, oh, he can't be a felon because then he'll have all of these collateral consequences like the ones that you mentioned. Again, Donald Trump has never cared about collateral consequences or any real reform of the criminal legal system until it happened to him. And still, he doesn't care about those black and brown people who are the main victims. He only cares about himself and other rich billionaires. But Alvin Bragg said that this sentence needed to go forward tomorrow because there needed to be respect for the jury verdict, for the rule of law, and for the principle that no person is above the law. Mm-hmm. And the three other criminal cases, that respect for the rule of law and equal justice of the law, we haven't seen that. Indeed. But in this case, with D.A. Bragg, finally, justice, a little bit of justice is done. And the only justice has been done by the state of New York, by Alvin Bragg and by Judge Marchand and by that jury. They are heroic in the sense they're the only people to have ever held this man accountable for anything he's done in this country, that he's done in aversion to the law.
Well, to understand the historic, apocalyptic, worst ever firestorm in Los Angeles, you can begin with the thought of what a hurricane would be without the wind. It would be a rainstorm. It could be a heavy rainstorm, but never more than a rainstorm. The water might find some leaks in your roof. There might be some huge puddles out there in the road that you can't drive through if it's a really, really bad rainstorm. But there would be very, very little actual destruction in a hurricane without wind, a rainstorm. Wind is the single most destructive force that exists in our natural elements. The destructive force of a hurricane is in the wind, not the rain. The wind speed is what you fear in a hurricane. The wind speed is what they keep reporting to you. The wind speed is what can kill you. That's why they want you to know it. The wind is what you're fleeing when you're evacuating a hurricane. The wind can sink the biggest ships ever built. The ocean doesn't sink those ships. The wind does. The wind creates those giant waves that can sink those ships. The wind can down airplanes. The wind can rip the roof off a building. A funnel of wind called a tornado can knock down everything in its path. They called it the Pacific Ocean when they first saw it, standing on cliffs in what's now California, looking out on that ocean, because after their experience with the stormy, windy Atlantic, they were looking at the calmest ocean scene they had ever seen, the most peaceful ocean they had ever seen. When they first stood on the west coast of this continent and looked out at that ocean on the edge of what is now called California, they thought, how peaceful, how Pacific. That's what Pacific means. They really couldn't believe that it wasn't just windy all the time, like an ocean is supposed to be. But wind is the most dangerous natural element in California. Wind can destroy much more than earthquakes can destroy. Because when a strong wind finds even the slightest spark, it turns it into fire and then turns fire into an explosion of flame and blows it at everything in whatever direction the wind is blowing. The prevailing wind in Los Angeles, the most common direction of the wind, is from the ocean to the land. The wind carries the coolness of the ocean air and the moisture of the ocean air. The most dangerous wind, the wind that is burning down Los Angeles tonight, comes from the east. It comes from the desert areas east of Los Angeles. And that wind, that deadly flamethrower wind, is named after a saint, Santa Ana. Almost all the place names in California are Spanish, since it is all territory that was once Mexico, seized by the United States. Even the wind has a Spanish name, Santa Ana. It is as hot a wind that blows in America. It travels over land with none of the cooling power of the ocean, none of the moisture of the ocean. It is dry. And when it's traveling over the driest of California land that hasn't seen rain during the rainy season, ignition is inevitable. It has to happen. It has to happen. And that is why, before a single spark emerged anywhere in Los Angeles, the fire department issued a warning the night before the fire started, saying that Tuesday would be an extremely high-risk fire day in Los Angeles, not because anyone was going to make a careless mistake with a cigarette, but because of the fact that the warm Santa Ana wind coming across the driest of winter Los Angeles in many years would surely somewhere be turned into fire. The question was just how big. And when the Santa Ana came, it was the worst wind Los Angeles had ever seen. Gusts up to 100 miles per hour. I've never seen winds at half that speed in Los Angeles. Gusting winds at hurricane levels, a hurricane with no rain, a hurricane with only the destructive power of wind until that wind found a spark. And then, instead of delivering rain, that wind, that hurricane force wind, helps the kind of wind that whips at you during a hurricane, whips rain at you during a hurricane. Instead of whipping snow at you as it does during a blizzard, that wind, the Santa Ana wind, delivered what it's famous for. It delivered what it's feared for. That wind didn't deliver fire, didn't deliver snowflakes. That wind, it did deliver fire. Didn't deliver rain or snowflakes. That wind delivered fire. The wind put that fire where it is tonight. And asking why the fire department doesn't have the resources to put out these fires is like asking why the New York Fire Department couldn't put out a fire on the 100th floor of the World Trade Center caused by burning jet fuel. The fire on 9/11 was in an unreachable place for firefighting technology, and everyone knew that. Everyone understood. That's why that was so horrible. And that's where the Los Angeles fires always start. They start in inaccessible wilderness areas where fire trucks cannot reach. It takes a while for people to know that there is even a fire happening in those places, and by that time, it's already raging toward homes. And the fire department starts on these fires as far behind a Santa Ana wind fire as the New York Fire Department was behind when they rushed toward the World Trade Center. There was nothing that they could do on 9/11. And that is a human truth that some people refuse to learn. Every once in a while, there's nothing that we can do. It is not within our human power. Every once in a while, something happens that is beyond our control. And yes, sometimes that's fire. Everyone knows when hurricanes stop. Hurricanes stop when the winds stop. No one has ever stopped a hurricane. That's what's happening in Los Angeles. It is a hurricane without the rain. It is a hurricane with fire. The hurricane can only stop when the wind stops. In the meantime, the firefighters are doing as heroic a job as firefighters have ever done in the face of a California fire. Everything that I have just told you about Los Angeles fires has been true for every day of our lives. And quite understandably, most people outside of Los Angeles, outside of California, don't really understand that. The brilliant writer Joan Didion moved to Los Angeles from New York at the peak of her writing career. She was from Sacramento, so she knew a bit of what she was getting into in Los Angeles, where she added screenwriting to her literary workload. And 57 years ago, in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, Joan Didion wrote, "Los Angeles weather is the weather of catastrophe, of apocalypse. And just as the reliably long, bitter winters of New England determine the way life is lived there, so the violence and the unpredictability of the Santa Ana affect the entire quality of life in Los Angeles, accentuate its impermanence, its unreliability. The wind shows us how close to the edge we are." Thousands of people in Los Angeles have discovered this week that they were over the edge, and they have gone over the edge into the oblivion of complete burnout. Not just their burned down home, but their completely burned down street in their completely burned down neighborhood. And I remain among the lucky ones living on the edge. In my case, while I'm here in New York City studio tonight, my house in Los Angeles is right on the edge of the fire. Fire trucks have been on my street for most of the last 24 hours, hoping to hold the line at or near my street if the winds decide to blow more strongly in my direction. It's not up to the fire. What happens to my house or any house in Los Angeles is not up to the fire. Tonight, our homes in Los Angeles, if they will survive, is entirely up to the wind. And Santa Ana is going to come back tomorrow. And as usual, she will bring no mercy.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. A lot happening today. In just over 13 hours' time, Donald Trump will be sentenced for his 34 felony convictions in New York. That is after the Supreme Court within the last hour or so denied his request for a delay. Now, barely. The 5-4 decision just came down in the last hour. Chief Justice Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett siding with the 3 liberals on the court, deciding that first, the alleged evidentiary violations at President-elect Trump's state court trial can be addressed in the ordinary course of appeal. That is usually how this works. Second, the burden that sentencing will impose on the president-elect's responsibilities is relatively insubstantial in light of the trial court's stated intent to impose a sentence of unconditional discharge after a brief virtual hearing. Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Alito, who just talked to Donald Trump on the phone yesterday, say they would have granted the stay. Go figure. But with the 5-4 decision, Donald Trump will be the first convicted felon to become president of the United States. We're just breaking barriers right and left these days. And he will have to appear virtually in a New York courtroom at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning for his sentencing. Lisa Rubin is an MSNBC legal correspondent. Christy Greenberg served as an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of New York, where she was deputy chief of the criminal division there. They both join me now. First of all, let me just start with you on the law here. Mm-hmm. You and I talked, and I'll just cop to it. I thought there was no way in heck this was going to happen. He was going to pull some rabbit out of a hat. I may have even said the words, "I'll bet $10,000 it never happens." I was wrong. He exhausted his appeals in New York court, right? So that Merchan ordered, then there's one intermediate appellate level. They said no. Then there's the ultimate appellate level. They said no. Then emergency filing the Supreme Court being like, guys, help me out. You've been there for me all along. Help me out. What was the argument his lawyers were making in the Supreme Court?
His lawyers were making sort of two arguments, Chris. One is that at the trial, there was evidence introduced at the trial on which the jury relied, for which he was entitled to immunity. So his argument goes under the Supreme Court's immunity ruling.
Right. Per John Roberts SCOTUS opinion last year.
Correct. That not only does the president have immunity from prosecution for his official acts or his core constitutional duties, at least, but he also has immunity from even having official acts evidence introduced in trials having purely to do with his private conduct. That was his first argument. His second argument was, I am a president-elect, and the same constitutional concerns that the Department of Justice recognizes with respect to sitting presidents and prosecuting them for any reason whatsoever, those should apply to me too, because I am very busy with very important things under the Presidential Transition Act, and you should therefore stretch your July ruling to cover this period too.
I might run for president someday. I think I get immunity, personally. That's my
the DA's
that's my new constitutional interpretation. Let's just keep going with this. You were surprised. You walked in, you're surprised.
Oh, yeah, I got this wrong. I really thought that they were going to bail him out once again, because that's what we've seen. And, you know, some cynicism was warranted. This was 5-4. There were 4 of these justices who were prepared to help him out here. I didn't count on the fact that Justices Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett would do the right thing here. But even then, the order itself is interesting. They say that the reason they're okay with this is because the trial court's stated intent is to impose this sentence of unconditional discharge, which means nothing. No jail, no probation, no conditions, nothing, nada.
Wait, just stop on there right there, because that is a tip to that argument, right? So they're saying, like, the equities that you're bringing forth, which is I am president-elect, and I do have many busy things to do, down meetings and calls down in Mar-a-Lago. They're saying, we hear you, but it's not going to be that bad a burden. But it's conceding that there's something there.
It is conceding, yes. And they're saying, and this sentencing is going to be a brief virtual hearing. Those are not typically words that are associated with sentencing of criminal defendants. Sentencings are not brief.
We'll get you in, we'll get you out.
Right. That's not how it works. For any other criminal defendant, you're usually looking at least an hour for a criminal sentencing, even in a pretty minor case. And they're not virtual for any other criminal defendant. They're always in person. So, yes, should we take the win, the fact that the sentencing is happening at all? Yeah, but this is not business as usual. This is not how it works for anybody else. Essentially, the American presidency is officially a get-out-of-jail-free card. That's what this is.
I have to say that I had gotten so cynical about this court that I thought, well, they'll find a way. And I thought they were going to issue some temporary order. We'll consider it. But of course, again, the shadow docket here and the emergency docket is so complicated procedurally that I was like, oh, do they need 3 votes or 4? Like, no, it's going to be actually found 5-4, whatever. Point being, though, to your point, it does also feel like there are 4 votes for whatever. Like, on the record, first time, right? This is the first Supreme Court ruling of the new Trump era. This is the first, the last time he had a 5-4 court in his favor with Kennedy as a swing voter. He now has a 6-3 vote in his favor with, Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett as the likely defectors to make a majority of the liberals. And this really feels like our first look at this court where there's 4 votes for, like, do whatever you want to do.
It's a pretty dire...
I mean, do you feel that way? Or is that, am I being
I'm a Pollyanna, and so I will always see the upside of this. The upside to me is that they tried to stretch the meaning of the July presidential immunity decision far beyond that which John Roberts, who was its author, intended for it to go. And therefore, I think it backfired on them. So in that respect, I was gratified to see that.
We have some breaking legal news.
Yes.
Do you know this?
Yes, the 11th Circuit.
Okay, so the 11th Circuit, which is the circuit that was reviewing an application by Donald Trump to stop the report from Jack Smith's office from coming out, has denied the request by Trump's co-defendants to block the release of special counsel Jack Smith's report, but left in place the 3-day delay that Judge Aileen Cannon instituted to allow for further appeals. So at the circuit court level on the Dox case, they're saying you don't get to stop Jack Smith from releasing this. We're going to leave in place this 3-day delay that Cannon put in that no one could find.
They're saying it's sort of procedurally, look, if you wanted to appeal her order, you should have appealed it directly, and therefore that 3-day period is going to stay in place sort of as a default. But it also gives Trump time, obviously, to now run to the Supreme Court because there's going to be a 3-day wait.
That's amazing. So there's going to be a SCOTUS writ petition, and they're going to get another. Already, he's not even in office yet, and there's going to be another swing here.
This one, I mean, again, Judge Cannon's order was so absurd. I mean, first, the case wasn't even before her. She had already dismissed it. And she issues this order to say the whole report can't be released, even the January 6th part, which wasn't even before her. So, again, this one, I feel fairly confident, at least with respect to the January 6th report, which Merrick Garland has said they intend to release, that will be released and that the Supreme Court won't block it.
We should also make the point here that I'm not sure how, I mean, in terms of the Dox case, like, we all read the indictment. Like, it's not like we're going to learn something shockingly new in this report, most likely. It seems more to me about I know you're shaking your head.
Yeah. Well, I think both
I'm wrong.
shaking our
Please.
head.
Okay.
So one of the things that Jack Smith said is that he had unclassified evidence that he intended to prove at trial that would say why Donald Trump had these classified documents in the first place, what he intended to do with them. That, to me, has always been the $64,000 question. Was he just holding them as trophies, or did he intend to sell them? Like, what was he doing? Why was it so important for him to keep these? And the fact, like, if we could get answers to those questions from Jack Smith in this report, that would have real value there. So there's a reason, I would think, why Donald Trump's team is trying so hard to keep this from being released. And unfortunately, Merrick Garland has agreed, except with respect to the classified documents case, that we're not going to see it. They don't intend to release it because there are these two co-defendants where they're still pursuing an appeal. But honestly, Donald Trump's DOJ is going to dismiss the charges against them anyway. So if you're weighing the public interest here, go ahead and drop the case against them and let us see the classified documents report.
I would say I want to see the classified documents report for a slightly different reason. There's a cast of characters here who witnessed the behavior or participated in it with him. And many of those people are scheduled to take important roles in the next Trump administration.
Handling classified information.
Including Susie Wiles, who is PAC representative in the indictment, including Kash Patel, who at one point in time was the designated liaison between the former Trump administration and the National Archives. So for those kinds of reasons, I would be really interested in seeing it, because think about how much we learned from the Mueller report with respect to all of the witnesses and the documentation and the back and forth between people. That's what I really want to see here, even if we could never get classified information.
All right, that's a really good point. So let's go back to, sorry, I'm keeping a lot of balls in the air today. Let's go back to the sentencing. So just walk me through what happens tomorrow at 9:30.
Tomorrow at 9:30, when we walk in, we will see a screen, in all likelihood, where Todd Blanche is with his client, Donald Trump, at Mar-a-Lago.
Maybe they choose like a cool Zoom background.
Maybe.
The American flag.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, Rudy Giuliani was instructed by a judge the other day to get rid of his American flag background, which is the joke Christie is making. But I think what we'll hear from first is we'll hear from the prosecution. Then the defense will have an opportunity to speak. And then he will give Trump himself an opportunity to speak. And what's crazy about that is, Chris, I've been at 2 trials already where Donald Trump has had an opportunity to speak. One as a witness, the other he wanted to make a statement. In both cases, he ended up getting into skirmishes with those judges about talking too long and about things that he had already been precluded from talking about. What happens when he's virtual? What does Judge Merchan do? Like, just cut the feed? That's sort of an open question about how this all unfolds tomorrow. But ultimately, and I think this is the part that Christie knows best, and the lengthiest part, is he will deliver a recitation of his reasons for imposing the sentence that he says he's going to impose, and at the end, sentence him officially to this unconditional discharge, as we're all expecting.
Yeah, and we've gotten a preview already of some of what Judge Merchan will say. In his opinion, he says that this crime from Donald Trump, these 34 felonies, represents the premeditated and continuous deception by the leader of the free world. Like, that's a pretty strong statement about how he views the gravity of this offense. And, you know, again, that's not normally something you would think is going to be met with no consequences whatsoever in terms of punishment. Just remember, again, to be kind of the Debbie Downer here, yes, it's good we're having a sentencing, but in a way, like, this is not the sentencing that he should be getting. He should be getting punished. Michael Cohen was sentenced to 3 years in prison for making this payment at the direction and for the benefit of Donald Trump. And he's somebody who pled guilty. Donald Trump went to trial. Michael Cohen accepted responsibility. Donald Trump has been in contempt of the gag order several times. So, like, this is something that you would expect if he were not going to be president in 17 days, he would have gone to jail for. So I expect also Donald Trump, if it's not Donald Trump, certainly his lawyers are going to go after Judge Merchan. their filings have been replete with statements about how he is acting unlawfully, how he is acting unconstitutionally. You don't normally see that. You can say to the judge, you got it wrong and we're going to appeal,
right.
but you don't usually hear, hey, you're breaking the law.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see
over
fireworks. 100%.
Here, woof, you're looking at a Shiba Inu dog, which is a mascot for a particular cryptocurrency. The dog refers to an internet joke from years back where there were jokes, captions, little words that accompany that now famous dog photo. But while the cryptocurrency that I'm mentioning here started as a joke, it actually became a global phenomenon, kind of an approachable alternative to Bitcoin, as Forbes reports. Now, the currency is called Doge. About $3 billion plus trades in this dog currency. This is the digital financial world we live in. And it's in the news tonight. I'll explain to you exactly why, because Elon Musk owns a bunch of this digital currency. You don't have to know the details. You don't have to have a strong view on whether cryptocurrency will matter or not in the future. Just know that Elon Musk owns it, and he uses his business platforms and fame to promote it so that it might go up in value. And if Elon Musk is effective in that effort and makes money by promoting this digital product through his business activities, that's fine. It's perfectly legal. Plenty of people both risk and make money that way, especially nowadays with a lot of stuff going on the internet. But Elon Musk's going a lot further. He wants big government help to make his money. You could call it Trump welfare or a subsidy. Some watchdogs call it a conflict of interest in government grifting. But I'm showing you that dog for a very serious reason. Musk is actually rushing to use his influence in this incoming Trump administration to get the government to promote that dog cryptocurrency. As a factual historical matter, that's very unusual. Now, there are plenty of outside groups which have advised presidents or the government, including on spending. I'm going to give you just a couple examples. There was a debt reduction commission. There's advisors on science. These are just their names. Pretty normal. This is deliberately dry or boring. You'll notice these commissions and advisory boards, which are for the public good, are named based on what they do. They're not branded Exxon or Coca-Cola. You don't see an Exxon commission there that gets the word Exxon running around, even if you had a former Exxon official involved. But Elon Musk's new spending advisory group has been named Doge to promote the dog cryptocurrency that he wants to profit from. Now, Musk made that acronym out of different words. So they call it Department of Government Efficiency. It's not actually a federal department, but they wanted to get the D in there, right? You have to have Congress if you want to create a department. But Musk is trying to get free media and promotion every time any outlet, print, digital, television, has to necessarily cover this incoming administration and what he says he's going to do as an outside advisor, and they end up saying Doge a lot, which promotes his crypto, the crypto he owns. Now, we will cover the advisory group when it's newsworthy, but other than this fact check, we're not going to be referring to it by this sort of business propaganda name designed to promote Musk's favored crypto. Now, this is a somewhat common ploy by Elon Musk, and I'm beginning with this not because it's a cute dog, not because we're trying to make some larger point, but because it's telling that this whole thing doesn't begin with a focus on you or saving you money or your tax dollars. It begins quite blatantly by promoting Elon Musk's financial interests. If you look at what he did with X and Twitter, remember, his career, where he has done some impressive things, wasn't about ACLU free speech advocacy, but he's run Twitter now to promote himself and his views. There's reports about censoring critics, amplifying allies. It's his company, he can do that, but it breaks those vows he made about free speech. Bit of a pattern here. A lot of talk about one thing, and then he does the self-interested business thing. The government, you should remember, also has a Budget and Accountability Office, which is supposed to deal with these things. And it has more power than the outside group that Musk and other Trump allies are now on about spending. In fact, a budget expert who ran a key government post actually recently noted that this Musk effort is really more like a think tank because they don't control the scope of government, the size of government. They can brainstorm, they can cajole, and they have begun doing that.
We expect mass reductions. We expect certain agencies to be deleted outright.
Do we really need, whatever it is, 428 federal agencies?
We'll be looking at everything from government-funded media programs like NPR.
I think we should be able to get away with 99 agencies. I don't know.
We are on the brink of something so revolutionary with the DOJ Commission.
Musk had floated some cuts going up to trillions. Now, he just lost the spending clash heading into the new year, if you were tuned out of the news, which is totally understandable. Basically, he showed a misunderstanding of certain budget details. He used his power to delay a bill that then got passed without some of the big asks that he and other Trump allies had made. But he did get a China rule gutted from that final package, which benefits his business. Note the pattern. Now he's begun changing some claims. He says it won't be necessarily $2 trillion in cuts. Maybe he's learning as he goes. But if you actually follow U.S. news, you might already know what Elon Musk appears to be learning, because you've probably covered and watched past battles about spending. From the Gingrich era to the Obama era, many talk about cuts, massive cuts. But when you get into it, the big ticket federal government spending items are, well, things like this. Trillions, right? That's big money, but on safety net programs like Social Security and health care, the United States military, defense, and then what you have to do, which is servicing interest on the debt. Many governments use that model of funding. So everything you're looking at on your screen are things that majorities tend to value or are basically required. You can't default on the interest. Now, an administration can cut other things. Vowing giant cuts, though, will run back into what I just showed you, things that Trump even vowed to protect, like the safety net. Now, we're going to be hearing a lot about this in the next few weeks, especially when they take office. And if you take a broader view, some of this is not specific to Elon Musk or Donald Trump. There are long-running clashes about the cost of the government. So let's take a look at that. There have been big jumps in spending, but if you'll notice, while both sides come into office and spend federal government money, what you're looking at, these are just facts and numbers, is the budget deficit by year. And while there's multiple factors, to be fair, you will notice that big Trump jump from the tax cuts and other things. And Trump wants to do more tax cuts. So there are valid policy trade-offs here. You can go across that recent history and talk about who wanted to spend what. Obama wanted to do Obamacare, which they did, and there was spending on that. Trump did what he did, including tax cuts, as Bush did, and there was spending on that. But the idea that one side is spending and the other isn't is false. And if you've heard or internalized Republican talking points or MAGA talking points that somehow they're not the ones spending and the deficit and the debt is someone else's fault, well, the numbers don't show that. Republican administrations have grown this debt, which you're now going to be hearing about a lot as an excuse or a rationale to do things. Sometimes, though, they're just blaming it on others, then hailing themselves as the one to do the spending cuts. And Trump allies, including Musk, have also, and this is important because, again, we're not bringing in people who are budget experts. Some of them Trump has chosen to bring in. He won the election. He can bring in advisors, but some of them are known for amassing money for themselves. Not for you, not caring about the federal government. I'll give Elon Musk this. It's proven fact he's very good at amassing wealth and building businesses, and that's fine. But he's done that partly by pocketing money from those tax cuts I mentioned. People like him will benefit the most because they make the most, they have the most in wealth. And he's taken plenty of government subsidies. And yet then they're the ones complaining that other people with less money should be the one tightening their belts. It's an old story, actually. We just now have new methods and mediums and internet hype about it. But they're saying slash the money, just not their money.
You put $90 billion, like 50 years worth of breaks into solar and wind, to Solyndra and Fisker and Tesla.
SpaceX has already earned more than $19 billion from its prime contracts with the government.
Two of Musk's companies have more than $15 billion in federal contracts with roughly a dozen federal agencies.
Now, that is just the factual history. And Elon Musk, who likes to name things and promote things and clearly is good at communicating, getting people talking about everything but what you see on your screen, which is he's financially tied to a dozen government agencies. So he's taking a lot of this money, and that might be valid. Indeed, I would mention there's been a bipartisan history of working with him on some of his companies, from space to green car companies, and that's fine. But he also wants to make you believe that he has the mantle of this outside advisor who will just cut all kinds of spending, or he's going to bargain with these agencies that he has a business relationship with, which is a blatant conflict of interest. In fact, it would be illegal to do what he's doing if he took a permanent, AKA real, government job. And that may be why Musk has held back on that. These are individuals who know how a lot of things work, and they clearly want to be outside advisors to sort of have it both ways, make a lot of noise, have influence over the very government that subsidizes them and their tax cuts and their business dealings or their China regulations, but not going in full time where you wouldn't be allowed to do that double dipping. More broadly, Elon Musk, who we've covered here because he's influential in many ways, has achieved certain things. Certainly revolutionized part of the green energy car industry in ways that a lot of governments, the United States included, think is positive. He also has a well-known history of over-promising.
We're going all the way to Mars, I think. That's
time frame.
Best case 10 years.
Is there a rough date for the Mars landing in your mind?
But 11 or 12 years. The Tesla car next year will probably be 90% capable of autopilot. So 90% of your miles could be on auto. The system worked as described, which is that it's a hands-on system. It is not a self-driving system.
What's the purpose of having autopilot if you still have to put your hands on the wheel, Elon?
What are supposed to be shatterproof windows, but against this metal ball?
Oh my God. Well, the evidence in the market and in the production of all kinds of business products shows Elon Musk to be effective. Both things can be true. He can be effective in that realm while still overpromising and underdelivering at times, and not necessarily be either an expert or a good faith advocate for you, the taxpayer and the citizen, about this spending.
Democrats struggle with their identity now as a party post-election. We'll find out if they're still clinging to that open border policy.
Why are you talking about an identity crisis? The Republican conference is filled with marauding bands of individuals who can't stand each other. And Democrats, as far as I can tell, are unified in our determination to make life better for the American people.
Marauding bands. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries hitting back yesterday after Speaker Mike Johnson accused Democrats of struggling with party identity after the 2024 election, not really knowing what it is. Meanwhile, NBC News has exclusive reporting that the incoming Trump administration is actively considering carrying out a high-profile raid targeting undocumented immigrants in the D.C. area. 3 people familiar with the discussions reveal the raid could take place within days of Trump taking office to send a message. Joining us now, one of the reporters who broke the story, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, good morning. So what more can you tell us about what the Trump team's considering here?
Well, Willie, of course, nothing is final yet, but we know that they're in discussions to try to figure out what resources they have to carry out workplace raids in the D.C. area. That could be in Maryland, D.C. proper, or in Northern Virginia. They could target a number of sectors. They're looking at things like agriculture, hospitality, and healthcare. This is to carry out what would be a shock and awe first operation, and it could be done, Willie, as soon as the inauguration day. This is because, of course, the president campaigned on making the incoming president campaigned on making this the largest deportation operation in American history, and he wants something to show for it when he comes into office. But workplace raids are historically very expensive and logistically difficult. They take a long time to plan, so that when ICE barges into a workplace and starts arresting people who they suspect to be living and working in the U.S. illegally, they know exactly who they're arresting and they don't make mistakes. So some current officials I've spoken to say they actually worry about the risk here if they try to take an action like this too early.
So, Julia, we've heard from Tom Homan, who is going to be Trump's border czar or immigration czar, whatever the title is exactly, who has said we are going to target criminals, hardened criminals first, that it's going to be a very difficult task to deport, as Donald Trump has promised some 11 million people here illegally. But how does that work exactly? What does that look like as a practical question?
Well, Willie, I think this reporting shows that they can't only target, they can only arrest the people who are the biggest threats. If they're looking at workplace raids, for example, most of the people who would be working in those places wouldn't be these hardened criminals that they want to go after. And if they're going to do a big sweep like that, of course they're going to be picking up people who have committed no other crime other than being in this country and working here without authorization. These could be families. There could be fathers who are deported while their children are at school when you're talking about a workplace raid. Now, we do know that there are over 400,000 people on ICE's non-detained docket. That means they're at large in the United States. Some of them could be serving time in prison who do have criminal convictions of some kind. So obviously they would want to start looking at that population. There are also people who already have final orders of deportation. They've exhausted all of their remedies for asylum or any other kind of benefit, and they were told by a judge to leave the country. That's who they want to target. But this kind of discussion really illuminates the fact that there is also a very strong voice within the incoming administration to say, cast the net as wide as you can and boost those deportation numbers, Willie.
Yeah, this was a key promise of Donald Trump during the campaign. It looks like he wants to deliver on it right away. Julia, you talked to the current ICE director about the Biden administration's handling of the immigration issue. What did he tell you?
Yeah, Willie, this was a really surprising and candid interview. This is outgoing acting ICE Director P.J. Lechleitner, who sat down with me and told me about some of the frustrations. He thinks that the current administration could have been more transparent and forthcoming on the immigration issue, and frankly, that Biden may have taken action too late to solve the border crisis. This is someone who's been with DHS since its inception. He's a 30-year career in law enforcement, served Republicans and Democrats. I think some of his remarks here are really enlightening. Take a listen. We saw millions of immigrants come across the border, and I know you're not focused on the border, but you're focused on the ramifications.
We're related
of that.
to it.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of that came down. Those numbers drastically fell, especially starting in June when the new executive action went into place. Do you think that Biden should have taken that action earlier?
Yes.
Why?
Yes. Absolutely, yes, he should have. The administration should have taken that action earlier, and I think the career people in DHS would have liked that, and all of us in DHS, quite frankly. I don't know if anybody in DHS wouldn't have wanted that earlier. Maybe there's some counselors here or there that don't like this kind of stuff, but law enforcement is always going to be on that side where we want, some tighter controls. Because for a while there, you remember, it was 10,000 plus.
Biden had an exit interview this week where he was asked about his regrets, and he did not mention the border. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me, but it's unfortunate because I think we could have done more.
What specifically?
We could have put more resources to it, either at CBP and for the border itself and with ICE. And we could have went and tried to get more of these individuals who are on the non-detained docket. And we could have detained more people, and we could have removed more people. And I think we could use more resources and support, and we could have done that in the last, 4 years.
Is it possible to increase your number of deportations under your current resources?
Under our current resources, no, because we're basically we're burnt, like I mentioned before, we're burning hot. We're at maximum resource capacity. At this point, we're going to need more money and resources to increase, and with more money and resources, we can increase detention, we can increase removal operations. Listen, there's still a whole immigration process, so people have to go through and you go through and get some benefit that comes out of it, and asylum, you name it, or you're ordered removed, and it has you go through the immigration proceedings and go through there. But with more resources, with more money, we can do more.
So a very candid conversation. We should say that was Lechleitner speaking from his own opinions. That's not the view of this administration, and we're reaching out to the White House for comment. But what this shows is that, for a lot of people who are career DHS, there was some frustration and really a thinking that they were doing a lot of work that wasn't being recognized because, at least in Lechleitner's opinion, the Biden administration wasn't doing more. And also to talk about it. And also when you talk about those resources, that's when he's looking at a new administration who's promising mass deportations. He says unless they have more money, it's really not possible.
What a fascinating interview, because you have an ICE director saying now publicly to you, Julia, what we've heard privately from them for several years. NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, thanks so much for bringing it to us. We appreciate it.